It's Ash from Super Videos, back for another video for The Last of Us. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at The Last of Us Part 3 video game. We're going to talk about everything that we know about that, and also I'm going to talk about a theory, which is whether it will be a prequel. So stay tuned, we'll be right back to break this down. Alright, as always, before we dive into it, smash the like button, subscribe to join our community, and press the bell to be notified when I upload on the channel. With that said, let's dive right into it. First things first, Neil Druckmann actually did an interview where he talked about his next project. Now, even though he didn't confirm that the next project will be The Last of Us Part 3, it is heavily speculated that the next project he's going to have is in fact Part 3 of The Last of Us. And this is what he had to say about his next project. He said that his next project will actually have a writer's room. And it won't just be one or two people writing the script. So unlike Part 1, which was his story, he wrote it, and Part 2, which was the story that two people wrote, Part 3 is gonna have a writer's room, which is definitely a very, very interesting detail that was revealed. And the first thing that I can think of when I hear that is that this could potentially be a result of the backlash for the story of Part 2 of The Last of Us. Now, obviously, we are assuming that the next project is The Last of Us. He could be talking about something else, but assuming that he is talking about Part 3 of The Last of Us, then it's definitely super interesting that Part 3 will have a writer's room rather than one or two people writing it, given that the story that they gave fans in Part 2 got a lot of backlash, and I would say that fans were definitely 50-50. There were a bunch of people that hated it, there were a bunch of people that loved it, and there were a few that were in the middle, just like myself. But this is definitely a very interesting detail that was released. The next thing that they talked about is how this next project, potentially Part 3 of The Last of Us, will have a TV show structure. Now, when I heard that, I was confused. What does that mean? And then the more I thought of it, the more I kind of put the pieces together in terms of what they could be referring to and what that could indicate. One thing that is definitely very obvious in TV structured series is that there's episodic stories. Now, even though there is one big story throughout, each episode focuses on one specific thing. Each episode has its own mini story. So I think one of the things that they could be talking about when they say it's going to have a structure like a TV show is that each part of the game will be episodic. Now, Part 2 already had that a little bit because we did see Abby day 1, day 2, day 3, and then Ellie day 1, day 2, day 3. I think they're gonna take that a level further, make each part or chapter of the story feel more like an episodic story, just like a TV show. The other thing that is definitely very apparent in TV structured series is that each episode ends on a pretty major note and it ends on like a cliffhanger or something like that. So it's definitely likely that we are gonna see cliffhanger-like notes in the story, but in video game format. We saw a bit of that also in Part 2, where we were looking at Ellie's story, and then when it was getting really interesting, they stopped the flow and we focused on Abby and stuff like that. I feel like they're gonna do similar things in Part 3 as well. Now, the next thing I thought of when I heard that it's gonna have a structure like a TV show is that it might feel like games like Telltale's of The Walking Dead and those types of stories, where the focus is not much on the video gameplay, but rather on decision making of the player. I'm not saying they're gonna follow the same thing and give us like a Telltale's for The Last of Us. What I am saying is that there's potentially gonna be more cutscenes, there's potentially gonna be more story-driven, cinematic scenes rather than actual gameplay. and the focus may be less on the gameplay and more on the story. Now, obviously, like I said, we still don't know if he's talking about The Last of Us Part 3 or another project. However, one thing that makes me feel like he might in fact be talking about The Last of Us Part 3 is this exact thing about this game being structured like a TV show. Obviously, The Last of Us HBO series is just around the corner, so I think this might actually be their way to create a video game that is easily adaptable into a TV show. So if they do in fact have The Last of Us Part 3 structured like a TV show, when we get to that season of The Last of Us HBO series, it'll be easier to adapt because it'll feel like a TV show. It'll be structured like a TV show. So it'll be easier to adapt, easier to take apart and put in the show, and not stop the flow of the story as much. Even though part 1 already has that because there's one main story, but like I've talked about before, it's difficult to break that story into different pieces and into different chapters unless you break it into the chapters just like the video game. So doing a TV structured video game may be their way to make that process easier. Now, let's talk about the theory that The Last of Us Part 3 might be a prequel. And this definitely aligns with some of the things we already talked about when it comes to the third game being episodic or structured like a TV show. I feel like what we might potentially see is a split in the story where parts of the story are going to be cinematic cutscenes where we're going to see backstory for some of the characters that were introduced that we didn't really get to explore their characters quite as much. Even though we are going to see cutscenes, we're not necessarily going to be doing any gameplay with those characters. So the players are just seeing the story unfold, they're seeing the backstories, but they're not really controlling the character or anything like that. And then in other parts of the game, in other episodic chapters of the game, we're actually going to be characters that are actually playable, like Abby, like Ellie, who we can actually explore the universe with. But that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in this video. I'm definitely interested to know your thoughts and opinions. Let me know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this, smash the like button, subscribe to join our community, and press the bell to be notified when I upload on the channel. That's it for this video. See you next time for another super video.